Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. It's great to see so many people here in the middle of the summer on campus. It's wonderful to have you here this evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for our program, The Rise of Economic Statecraft, Economic Policy, and National Security in the Era of Great Power Competition. My name is Tom Candon. I'm the Senior Associate Director for the Initiative for Global Security here at the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. Along with the Institute and the newly launched International Security and Economics Pilot, we are co-sponsoring this event with our colleagues from the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences and the Dartmouth Lawyers Association, and tonight's program is part of the Rockefeller Center's Volk Lecture Series. I know that sounds like a lot of co-sponsors, and it is, but there's so many of us here on campus who wanted to be a part of our distinguished guest visit, so here we are. As such, I'd like to thank a number of people who helped bring together this event and the other programs associated with our distinguished guest visit. They include the Rockefeller Center Director Jason Barabas, Dickey Center Director Tori Holt, Initiative for Global Security Faculty Director Daryl Press, our Dickey Center Events team, Judith Van Ryn Jackson, Nyla Waddell, and especially my colleagues at the Rockefeller Center, Associate Director Herschel Nachlas, and Assistant Director for Public Programs, Devorah Greenberg-Kohling, who has done a lot of work to bring together this program tonight. For a bit of background on how this visit and this program came together, a few months ago, my colleague Herschel got together with me for a meeting and mentioned he'd recently been in touch with Mike Pyle, who is stepping down as the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, and was wondering if we at the Dickey Center would be interested in hosting his visit. I thought, Deputy National Security Advisor, President Biden's point person at G7 and G20, lead negotiator with allies on clean energy, China policy, Russian statecraft, previously Chief Economic Advisor to Vice President Harris. Seemed like it might be a little bit of a fit for the Dickey Center and the Initiative for Global Security here on campus, so we went with it. And it's been a great visit thus far. I can't tell you how happy we are to have had Mike here, and as part of this launch of the International Security and Economics Pilot, which is being led by Professor Nina Pavcnik here. In addition to his recent work as a Deputy National Security Advisor, President Biden, and Chief Economic Advisor to Vice President Harris, Mike held roles in the Obama White House and the Treasury Department from 2009 to 2013. In between his two-time stints in government, he served for 7 years at BlackRock, where he rose to become the global chief investment strategist. He's a lawyer by training, where he attended Yale Law School and Cambridge University, and his first job out of law school was as law clerk to Judge Merrick Garland. But most importantly for us here on campus, Mike is a member of the class of 2000 and a former member of Rockefeller Center's Board of Visitors. In a 2021 profile of Mike in Dartmouth Alumni Magazine, as he was about to join the Biden and Harris administration, Mike noted that it was while studying economics at Dartmouth that he, quote, recognized that economics was a toolkit for understanding why people, why firms, why governments, why institutions made the choices they did. It was a comprehensive lens of understanding the things I cared about, how public policy can be used to shape people's lives, the lives they want to live. In the 2 weeks Mike has been with us, he has shared this understanding and the experience he has gained with numerous groups and individuals across campus, and it has been an honor to host him. Joining him on the stage this evening is Nina Pavcnik, the Niehaus Family Professor in International Studies and Professor of Economics. Nina's research examines how international trade affects the lives of workers, families, and children with implications for inequality and poverty in lower income countries. She also studies how companies respond to globalization. Nina also consults on issues related to global trade and economic development for the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, Inter-American Development Bank, United Nations, and the U.S. Department of Labor. At Dartmouth, she has served as the chair of the Department of Economics and received the Dean of Faculty Award for Outstanding Mentoring and Advising. And as I mentioned, she is now leading our International Security and Economics Pilot. One note before I turn over the floor to Professor Pavcnik, and that is that we will have a Q&A session this evening. We do have two colleagues in the room who will have microphones. Please, when called upon, wait for the microphone so that the people watching at home can hear your questions. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Nina. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom, for giving me the honor of moderating a conversation with Mike. As an economics professor, I'm delighted in how you described the influence that economics had on you. For all the students in the room, thank you for coming. What I want to mention is about 10 years before Mike graduated from Dartmouth, Cold War ended. And he graduated from Dartmouth right around the time when China was entering World Trade Organization. We are now almost 25 years after that. You were not even born then. And the world is completely different. So this is a great time to be reflecting and thinking about the statecraft. What I want to start with is the question on how does one balance domestic political interests and goals with foreign policy interests in keeping alliances together? What are the trade-offs involved? And how does the decision-making in the administration handle these situations?
Sure, I think it's a great place to start. And first of all, just really thank you for hosting me up here at Dartmouth. It's been an extraordinary month to reconnect with the place. And at this time of year, just a really extraordinary thing. And so thank you for that. So I think that question really gets to the root of a lot of the tensions and trade-offs that you face sitting in the White House in a role that straddles national security and economics. And I think that, it really came to the fore just to take a kind of very front of mind example around the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the ways in which we implemented it, in particular, bearing in mind a lot of the concerns that some of our closest allies in the world were expressing about it. So, as many of you may recall, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, the most significant piece of climate legislation the United States has passed by the skin of its teeth in a very closely divided Congress and even more so United States Senate. And of course, a set of judgments, trade-offs, choices were made to get that bill across the finish line with the barest of majorities. Our allies woke up the next day and said, and this is, in Europe, the Germans, the Brits, the Japanese, the Koreans in Asia, our closest friends in the world, and said, on one hand, we've wanted you guys to take the climate threat seriously and to act commensurate with the scale of that threat for decades. And at long last, Joe Biden and this administration have shown up and done it. But we know that a number of the provisions of it seem to, on the face of it, favor doing business in the United States with U.S. firms rather than being open, being even-handed with respect to European businesses or Japanese and Korean car makers. And that kind of gives us some concern. And so, my job, sitting where I sat, among other things, was to really go out and make the case for what we had done, why it was both in America's interest, but in the world's interest, in the interest of our allies, and then also take a set of steps that made clear that we didn't see this as something we were doing just for us, even though it would benefit the United States, but we were rather doing something that we thought was a model for the rest of the world, including our closest allies, and put in place a set of steps that allowed us to cooperate, to coordinate, to act in common in ways that would make sure that the IRA and steps that other countries took were lifting all boats on the clean energy transition, on the climate threat challenge, on the types of investments we needed to be making ourselves collectively. And it wasn't just U.S. versus our allies situation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Could you elaborate on an example of such a step that benefited U.S. and the allies?
Absolutely. I'd say, a couple of things. One, when you think about clean energy supply chains, you think a lot about the production of electric vehicles, the supply chains that create batteries that are obviously a key input, not just for EVs, but for the grid and broader clean energy efforts. And then when you think about batteries, you think about the types of raw materials that go into those batteries and where they're sourced. The Europeans in particular, and the Japanese as well, were very focused coming out of the shock that they faced with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a recognition that they had been too reliant on Russian energy, that they looked to their battery supply chains and worried about a similar kind of dependence growing on China, in particular around supplies of critical raw materials, the processing of those critical raw materials, the ways in which those would go into battery supply chains. And they said, listen, we cannot exchange one set of dependencies, our dependencies on Russian energy, for another set of dependencies, our dependencies on Chinese battery supply chains. We know you feel the same. What can we do together through the Inflation Reduction Act to build a much more comprehensive, integrated approach on sourcing critical minerals, critical raw materials, the processing of those minerals, so that we begin the process of diversifying ourselves away from China and Chinese clean energy supply chains, so that we don't face the same kind of concentrated geopolitical risk that we had with respect to Russia. And that's the kind of thing that the IRA empowered us to do, that we went out and have been working very hard, and my colleagues continue the work of, to demonstrate the promise of working across oceans with allies on common problems, like making sure we're not all reliant on the same single sources of failure on the next generation of energy like we were with the past generation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, the Inflation Reduction Act was a big, step forward in the Biden administration on the climate change issues. At the same time, though, the Biden administration has kept in place most of the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. So could you speak a little bit about the key differences in international economic politics across the two administrations when it comes to trade policy?
Sure. I would highlight two principal differences, and I think this isn't, of course, just a conversation about looking back into the past. It's also a conversation that has pretty significant consequences for policy going forward as well, given the stakes, obviously, in November. The two things that I would call out are, yes, it's true that the president and this administration chose to keep the tariffs that it inherited, particularly vis-a-vis China, in place. That being said, where the administration or the president chose to increase those tariffs, it was done in a very targeted, strategic way. The president announced the results of what was called the 4-year review of the 301 tariffs that we inherited back in March, I believe it was. And the president basically didn't touch the vast majority of the tariffs, but on $16 billion worth of goods, things like EVs, things like batteries, things like critical minerals, things like solar panels, the types of things we've just been talking about, where the U.S. was making significant strategic investments in our own capacity, where our allies were making significant strategic investments in their own capacities. Those are the places where the president chose to increase the tariffs that we inherited from President Trump. But again, that wasn't across the board. That wasn't, just willy-nilly. That was a very strategic, thoughtful approach to, in a very targeted way, increase tariffs that we think are going to allow us to see those investments through to fruition and allow, ultimately, our own capacities to grow and develop in a way that allows us to diversify away from that type of dependence on China. So that would be the first distinction I would draw. The second is, and something we've been talking about in this conversation so far, the centrality of allies and partners in our approach. I mean, the president, at some level, has kind of in my space, the space that I operated in, like two animating impulses. One is that America is awesome, and America can do anything it puts its mind to, and America is going to invest in itself and reinvest in itself and rebuild its capacity to do great things and define the next generation of technology and the next generation of industrial innovation. That's his first conviction. His other conviction is, the United States acts most strongly in the world when it acts alongside our key allies and partners. We are stronger when we act together. That is core to who he is. It's core to how he's governed. It's core to a lot of the issues that I worked on. And so a lot of what I did as well was work with our closest allies in the G7, work with partners elsewhere in the world like India or other key emerging economies to really try to construct a much more common approach on how to manage, how to address the economic and geopolitical competitive challenge that China represents. I think that idea that we need to act alongside our allies and partners, and that may mean that we don't act with the same speed and with the same kind of unilateralism that I think you sometimes heard from the Trump administration, that I think you hear again from the candidate and his team this time around, was to President Biden a sensible choice that ultimately would allow the United States to act with greater force and effect in the world, because when the United States joins forces with the rest of the G7, with a lot of other partners around the world, we act with a lot greater impact and force than even when the United States, for all its strength and position in the world, doesn't act when it acts alone. So those to me were the two key hallmarks of difference between this president and the administration that came before, and I think at some important level, like even with obviously some of the changes we've seen in the presidential race, I think the choice that's really going to be on display this fall as well.
Yeah. Thank you. So China keeps coming up. How should we think about China? In the past, the geopolitical rivalries that the United States had were with countries such as the Soviet Union, where the United States did not trade much with them.
Yeah.
With China, we trade a lot. So, can common ground and working relationship be found on certain issues while also recognizing kind of the geopolitical rivalry inherent in the relationship? How does one do that?
Yeah, so I'm pretty cautious on the idea that there's going to be a significant affirmative agenda that we achieve with China. I don't think that's the goal of this administration's policy, and I think that it is appropriately not the goal. I sort of compare that to, the U.S.-China relationship I was a part of in the Obama years, which had a lot of continuity with the kind of Bush and Clinton approaches that came before it, where there was a lot of focus and emphasis on how can we sit down formally across the table from the Chinese, identify a set of common interests, identify a set of concrete steps that we can take together to advance those interests. That is, I think, not been shown to be a ultimately effective way of advancing U.S. interests, and ultimately not, I think, it was predicated on a misunderstanding of our ability to actually shape and change Chinese decision-making and the country that China is and is going to become. So I think we're much more clear-eyed, I think, on that right now. I think there are sort of limited small steps that we can take together. I think you saw some of those come out of the president's meeting with President Xi in person in California last November. Restarting things like military-to-military direct communication, having China take a very limited set of steps on cracking down on fentanyl and opioid precursors coming into the United States. Those are small steps, important ones. Obviously, the opioid crisis is devastating to so many communities, and a lot of those precursors come from China. Getting them to take some step there is important. Things like military to military communication, important to ensure that the channels of communication are there so we can avoid mistakes, avoid misunderstandings of intent in ways that could really steer the relationship off course and into a much more dangerous setting. But those are kind of pretty limited expectations for what the relationship can accomplish affirmatively. I'd say the bigger emphasis, and I'm sorry, I've already spoken too much in this answer, but to get into the kind of conversation in the main around what I think this administration, this president accomplished on China, was to recognize that across a bunch of different dimensions, we're going to have a very, very competitive relationship with China across economics and technology and influence globally and a range of other dimensions. This is going to be a very competitive relationship. And it's one where the United States is not going to take its foot off the gas pedal in competing. We're not going to take our foot off the gas pedal in investing in ourselves, like through infrastructure, like through the energy transition, like through chips and science. We're also not going to take our foot off the gas pedal in terms of taking a set of steps vis-a-vis China to preserve and protect our national security. And I was a part of a number of those, things like putting export controls on the most advanced semiconductors that could feed China's military and surveillance modernization. Things like limiting outbound investment from U.S. venture and other investors to those same industries in China that, again, could propel their military modernization. Those are important steps that we can take that we think are necessary to take to protect our national security, and we didn't take our foot off the pedal on any of those. The flip side of that is, as my former colleague and boss, Jake Sullivan, would put it, intense competition requires intensive diplomacy. And we were engaged in that across, in particular, 2023. And I think you saw the fruits of that diplomacy in terms of a U.S.-China relationship that, as competitive as it is, ultimately got to a place of some stability, some basic equilibrium between the countries in ways that I think have helped to ensure that this isn't a competitive dynamic that veers off into conflict, but one that is ultimately competitive while remaining stable. And I think the secret to that diplomacy was, again, not taking our foot off the gas pedal, but being pretty clear with them every step of the way, the steps we were going to take, why we were going to take them, importantly, why we weren't taking them, so as to do our part to dispel misunderstanding, dispel the risk that they would misassign our intent or our rationale about why we were taking the steps that we were taking, and to do that at all levels, from the president's level to cabinet secretaries like Secretary Yellen and Blinken and Raimondo to Jake, to myself and others. It was a really kind of all of the administration effort to fan out and be very disciplined, but very focused on communicating what we were doing and why.
Thank you. So, continuing on this discussion of negotiations and diplomacy, you describe yourself in your biography as President Biden's Sherpa to the G7 and G20 meetings. What is it like being a Sherpa for a major economic meeting? What does it entail? And what did you learn from that?
First of all, it's a deeply anachronistic name, but it is one that survives. So, in some sense, a lesson in the inertia of diplomatic terminology. I would offer a couple of vignettes from that. One, the G7, which of course is the United States and the group of the kind of other kind of most advanced industrialized democracies, has gone through kind of different periods of relevance and less relevance. For example, when I was in the Obama White House, at that time it was the G8. It included the traditional G7 plus Russia. it was at that time viewed as a kind of virtually moribund institution. The kind of world had passed it by. The G20, which included China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, the kind of great rising countries of the global economy, was really where the discussion was at and where we needed to get things done. I think fast forwarding 10 years, in some ways those positions have been flipped again. That particularly post Russia's invasion, the sense that we needed to get things done with our closest allies and to move productively at speed and scale to confront not just Russia's aggression, but a whole host of challenges that we were facing in common. It became an extraordinarily important body for coordinating and getting things done. And the thing that I would highlight there, just in terms of vignette, is again, there was a lot of productivity around taking common steps on Russia, on sanctions, on energy, things like the oil price cap, which we talked about in the session last week. But importantly, it was also a venue where how we were going to approach China with a common set of principles was also really hashed out. And you kind of chart this path over a couple of years, and you really see a huge amount of diplomatic work kind of moving that needle. So you go from the last year of President Trump's term, where literally the word China didn't come up in the G7 leaders' declaration, to the first year of President Biden's term, where you see the first mention of China, to my first year, Germany's G7, where you see a more complete set of discussions of China, to the last year I did the G7 in Japan, where you basically see the G7 countries say, listen, we're each our own sovereign country. We're each going to carve our own approach on China in some particulars. But there are a set of principles that are going to guide us in common, both in terms of what we see constructively in this relationship, what we see about the ways in which we don't want to decouple our economies from China. We do want to de-risk them, about the ways in which we don't want to be seen or in reality have the effect of preventing China's growth and development. And yet, there are also a set of things that we're concerned about in common, about advanced technology, furthering China's military modernization, about the types of economic practices that have consistently tilted the playing field against the United States and other Western democracies, about the types of economic coercive activities that they've undertaken to try to browbeat or put other countries, smaller countries often, under a kind of economic thumb. These are things that we can speak to full-throatedly in common, but the amount of diplomatic work that went into moving that needle from 2020 to 2023 was huge, and I can't even begin to tell you how many hours locked in a room with various Europeans it took to get some of that done. But it was, incredibly worthwhile, because I think the conversation moved so constructively in a direction that was inconceivable a few years ahead of that. If I may, I think the G20 is also a very interesting forum. Again, not viewed as the place where you can get things done in a way that people had hoped, and in some ways that it was post the global financial crisis, but a venue that's incredibly important precisely because, again, China's at the table, Brazil is at the table, India is at the table, Indonesia is at the table, Russia's at the table. And so, what I spent a lot of my time on in the G20 over both years I was there was actually getting the G20 to speak collectively about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the consequences of that for the global economy. And the interesting thing there, first in the Indonesia G20 and then in the India one, is, this is not something that a lot of the emerging countries wanted to speak to at all. But it was, I think, important for the global system, important for the G20, important for the United States and our allies to make clear that this is the kind of breach of international law, of kind of core global values that can't be allowed to stand and can't see an important moment like this, like a G20 summit pass, without speaking forcefully to it. And so across both those years to craft a solution that brought on board the important emerging countries around the world that were hesitant to speak to it, but were persuaded to do that, and to put enough pressure on Russia so that they had to sign up for it as well. That was a really interesting window into a lot of different pieces of global diplomacy, and something I take some pride in having the U.S. having accomplished.
Great. So, how has, you have a lot of real life experience at really high level negotiations and international diplomacy. How did your education at Dartmouth prepare you for the work that you do in this area?
Well, I mean, first of all, it was absolutely essential to the person and the professional that I've become. I did a bit of I majored in economics here, did a bit of graduate work in economics, went to law school, but it was really in terms of being an economic policymaker in the Obama White House, both on the domestic and international side, doing the same in this administration with a stronger flavor of diplomacy and national security. Just again and again, what I turned back to were the frameworks, the intuitions, conceptual understandings, the ability to sit down with a piece of empirical work and read it, digest it, understand it, probe it, get a sense of its veracity. Those were all things I learned as an economics major at Dartmouth. Doug Irwin, who's sitting back here, with just a range of other professors. I do have to feel, I will say as a joke before I make one additional point, I feel every day here that I'm kind of working to do penance for the sins against international trade that I did in my time in government versus what I learned from Professor Irwin. But the other thing I would say is, I was saying this to you the other day. I came to Dartmouth thinking I would be an economics major, and I left Dartmouth an economics major. There was an interregnum there where I thought I was going to be a history major, where I thought I was going to be an English major, where I thought I was going to be a philosophy major, and then I came back to economics. But I came back to economics for an entirely different set of reasons than what I had come to Dartmouth thinking was the reason why I was going to be an economics major. I'd come to Dartmouth thinking I was going to be an economics major. I'm from a little town in the Midwest, 600 people in the middle of Illinois. If I hadn't gone to Dartmouth, I would have gone to the University of Illinois. I would have been a business administration major there. And economics was the closest thing Dartmouth offered to business administration. And so I thought, this is what I'll do. And then, you get here and you get exposed to the place and the liberal arts tradition and all a place like Dartmouth, steeped in that tradition, has to offer, and the world all of a sudden becomes just incredibly bigger than it was to 17-year-old me in a farm town in Illinois. And that was part of that journey to history, to English, to philosophy, and then back to economics for many of the reasons that Tom pointed out in that Dartmouth Alumni Magazine piece. I came to realize that quite apart from being a vocational pursuit, economics was a toolkit to understand the world and to make sense of it and to put the pieces of it together in all the ways that I wanted to, whether it was around public policy or politics or the way business and financial actors made choices in the world, or individuals and households. And that toolkit was what brought me back. But it was really, a journey through the liberal arts tradition that brought me back.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. As you have heard from Tom, Mike has also served as the chief economic advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris, having worked on her 2020 campaign. So you can imagine that there are
people interested in that.
So we all know that Vice President Harris is brat.
Yes.
But could you let us know, how her views on economic policy potentially differ from President Biden's views?
I think differ is not quite the right word. I think that, she and the president stood shoulder to shoulder and have built an economic record that they're proud of and that she's going to go out and make the case for and defend, and draw a contrast with her opponent on over the next 3 or 4 months. What I do think is, they were a team. And as with any team, there were places where, against their agenda, she thought she could put her voice to work and her shoulder to work, and places where the president was a much more kind of natural voice for pieces of their agenda. So maybe just a couple of vignettes or thoughts on what I saw in terms of places where, kind of against the backdrop of a very common record and agenda, I saw her want to put her voice to work. The first would be, just the basic pocketbook issues that working families face. And in particular, I really saw this around her work on the expanded child tax credit. So if you'll recall, the American Rescue Plan included an expanded version of what's called the CTC, the child tax credit, that did a couple of things. One, it increased the amount of money that was available to families for every child they had. 2, it increased the income thresholds for it, so it became, so it reached further up into the income distribution and further up into the middle class. And 3, and importantly, it made it what's called refundable. So you didn't need positive income tax liability in order to claim it. This is important because it means that really low-income families are able to realize the full benefit of the child tax credit. This is something, it seems very kind of wonky, but it makes a huge difference. It's something she had championed in the Senate. She had co-sponsored a bill to do just this alongside Senators Booker and Bennett. She fought for it to be included in the rescue plan. It was the last thing into the rescue plan as it was being designed and finalized, and I think her voice made a difference on it making it in. And then something she was out on the road just touting at every step once it was passed into law. And, it was only there for a year for a complicated set of reasons, having to do, again, with a closely divided Senate, wasn't renewed. But we can look back and see the numbers now. And we know that child poverty in the United States in the 1 year it was in effect was basically cut in half. So we learned, in line with the vice president's values, that it is within our power, it is within the power of policymakers in the United States to cut the number of kids who live in poverty in half. And that's core to who she is. It's core to what she fought to deliver on when she was vice president. I'd also say, she, both as a matter of economics, but also as a matter of values, feels incredibly strongly about small business and entrepreneurship. She believes that not only do small businesses create jobs, create opportunity, create dynamism in the economy, but it's also a way for people to kind of express their ability to, carve their own path in life, to make the mark for themselves, their family, their community that they want to be able to make. And so really championing small business was a key part of what she did and what I saw. And I saw that in 2 particular ways, literally right out of the gate. Her first meeting with outside voices, with kind of ordinary Americans after taking the oath of office, was with a set of small business owners 36 hours after she came into office. And it was a time, of course, still in the midst of COVID, when it was hard to run a small business. Life was not back to normal. And she wanted to hear about the challenges they faced and the struggles they faced and what was working and not working with the efforts of the government to support them through that challenge. And the other piece of it I saw was, her willingness to get on the phone. We took a look at the data from what's called the PPP plan. This was the emergency lending plan for small businesses. And we saw that, a few of the big banks who had been huge drivers of the success of the PPP over the spring and summer of 2020 had kind of not been delivering in the next slug of it in the way that she thought they should, we thought they should. So she got on the phone with a bunch of the CEOs of some of these big banks, and she said, we see you're not delivering the way you did. We got our eyes on you, and we want to make sure that you guys know that we're focused on this. And we're here as a team to support your team to solve any bottlenecks or challenges that you face, because we're in this together. But we need you guys to step up and not kind of think that this is in the past, because there are small businesses out there still struggling that need what you can provide them through the programs that we've set up. So that willingness to kind of hold feet to the fire, but be a partner to get things done for Main Street was something, I saw firsthand.
Great, thank you. So let us open some questions for the audience. Just please make sure before you ask the question to get the microphone so that those joining us virtually can hear it too. Yeah, gentleman there.
Oh, sorry. Got it. Hi. Just to follow up on that point you made about Kamala Harris talking to big banks about PPP loans. Did anything culminate from those conversations?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with a bunch of me and a couple of colleagues from the National Economic Council on the president's side, and then people at the SBA and Treasury spent a lot of time with some of the implementation teams from those banks, really working through day in and day out some of the challenges that they said they were facing to kind of get more lending out the door and to increase their processing speeds and time. And it was basically we're not going to give you any excuse to kind of push this down your priority list. We're going to be in front of you day in and day out, signaling yet again this is a priority for us, and signaling that we're here to help you solve problems, but we're also here to tell you need to be solving those problems actively alongside us. So that's what I did. And then the vice president would be on me kind of every day or two saying, well, where are we at on this? Do I need to get back on the phone with whomever? But I really do think that it worked the way you'd hope it would work.
Thank you. There's a question up front there.
Thank you for presenting today and opening to the public, so us just living in the area and not paying tuition here get a chance as well. So it's intriguing to think about the scope of your career in the different administrations, because you've seen a lot of things happen. I'm wondering how much it intruded into some of your international leadership conversations that some of our American flagship corporations like Boeing, Microsoft, Google, also our entire healthcare enterprise, as was discussed in the New York Times a couple of years ago, that some of the A-list healthcare corporations have been systematically bilking Medicare Advantage to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars in the aggregate. Did any of those kinds of reveals, if you will, that the American mission and purpose and the American brand of honesty, integrity, and reliability is showing, shall we say, some fraying at the edges? Did any of that surface in any of your discussions? You can just say no.
No, I mean, I'm trying to think about how to approach that, because, I think the answer is kind of yes and or no but. I think in particular, to look in the technology space, I think that's a space where obviously some very large American platforms, enterprises, have been really important to shaping the world we as Americans live in, but also the world that a lot of other people around the world live in, including those of some of our closest friends and allies. And I would say two things. One, I think this administration has been pretty focused on an agenda of, accountability around some of the places where those big firms have gotten it wrong, have displayed the kind of, have made some wrong steps that have, frayed the fabric of a bunch of different things. And I think that, some of our closest friends, like in Europe, have had similar instincts. And so there's been, certainly, I think, more skepticism with respect to some of those companies than was the case, 10 years ago when I was in the Obama administration, and appropriately so. And I can say, one place where it would, be impactful for me is I know that, the people at the chairs that I had a decade ago, spent a lot of time pushing Europe, pushing other allies around the world to be less skeptical of America's kind of technology, champions, for lack of a better word. And that's not a conversation that sort of I or any of the other senior folks in the administration were particularly kind of interested to go out and do battle on, because I think we shared our own skepticisms, and those skepticisms came from the president and the vice president as well. Now, the flip side of that is, as we've talked about, America having an innovative edge, having an ongoing ability to define the frontier of a bunch of different types of technology, including AI, is really important. And being sure we're also working with companies big and small, and working with our allies to create space for our companies big and small to continue to innovate and help us define the innovative frontier across a bunch of different industries is also a really important conversation. And I think in particular, as a range of issues around our national security edge, around AI came to the forefront, that required a kind of a new type of thinking that wasn't just skepticism as well.
Yes, student back there.
You talked a little bit about tools that the administration has used to advance domestic industry in terms of specifically climate change with the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm curious, kind of moving forward, how you anticipate securing American supply lines against Chinese anti-competitive trade practices. Kind of what tools moving forward will be using, whether that's more, Section 301 investigation, Section 232, on the tariff front, or subsidies, or even alternatively, more collaboration with allies to, establish supply lines outside the U.S., but with more aligned states.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, I think it's like a little bit all of the above. I'd be surprised if I think a few things. I think one, this begins with making a set of investments in ourselves and our own capacities. And I think the work of, a next Democratic administration, if that's the world we're in, that's the world I know best, would begin with continuing the sound implementation of the big domestic investments that this president and administration started. And there's going to be a really long tail on those. And doing that right and doing it well will require ongoing effort for years. But I think that's not enough. I think as a result, the types of partnerships that I described with like-minded allies and partners around the world is a really important part of this too. That's everything from the types of cooperation on critical minerals that I described to going out and making the case to our European friends and our Japanese friends and others that, listen, the IRA is a model. The CHIPS Act is a model. You guys should do your own versions of these things and invest in rebuilding your own capacities. And I think we've seen a lot of progress in that regard. Japan has passed something very similar to the IRA into law. Canada, similar. Europe has passed something very similar to the CHIPS Act. Is in the midst of a very complicated political negotiation around doing something called the Green Industrial Deal that looks a lot like the IRA, but is kind of bound up in some very complicated intra-European politics. But I think that is all part and parcel of the approach as well. And then the third thing I'd say is, there is a role for more competitive or defensive economic instruments as well. Things like export controls on advanced semiconductors, on the core set of advanced technologies that can generate military modernization amongst our geopolitical rivals. There's a role for that kind of tool and persuading our allies and partners to join in that effort. There's a role even for, I think, very thoughtful, careful, targeted tariffs to ensure that the non-market distortions of very big economies like China doesn't fatally or even significantly undermine the strategic investments we're making. Like if we're going to invest in our own capacities, we can't have Chinese overcapacity undermining those and hollowing out again America's industrial capacity. And interestingly, I think that on that last point, you've heard this really from across the board in the administration. Secretary Yellen was in Beijing a couple of months ago. And fundamentally, at some level, the message I heard her deliver was, 15 years ago, we thought that, it was okay if you guys wanted to subsidize a bunch of stuff that we bought in exchange for IOUs. And today, we know that's not an okay solution. We know that that's not okay for our national security. We know that that's not okay for American workers and businesses that are otherwise situated on a profoundly unlevel playing field. And, we're going to see to it that the investments that we're making are allowed to stand on their own two legs and aren't undermined by the same playbook that may have gotten deployed a decade and a half ago.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There was a question in the second. Yeah. Right here.
Ooh, I think we're answering that.
Oh, sorry. There's, go ahead.
My question is...
You'll have the last question. So this question, then you'll have the last question.
Okay, so
sorry.
I'm good?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I get to go first, do I? Fine. Thank you. Could you comment on the trade-offs you see between economic growth and the move to clean energy, and how that has affected conversations that the US has had with its allies?
Could you maybe just give me two more sentences, like elaborate on the type of trade-off that you see?
Well, it's widely viewed, I don't know whether you share the view or not, that moving too fast towards clean energy and decarbonising the environment is going to slow down economic growth, because the great movement of human progress can be tracked very neatly with the cost and availability of energy and the quality of energy as we've moved forwards. And I think it's quite one of the interesting aspects of politics and trust in politics which has occurred has been consistently, number one, politicians understanding the importance of immigration, but also essentially lying to their populations about that importance because their populations don't like immigration. So we've seen a reduction in trust in politics there. And secondly, the issue of the imperative to move towards clean energy, which is clearly important for us as a huge global community, against the issues of slowing down economic growth by doing that too fast. And essentially, I suspect that's another dangerous touch point of trust loss between politicians and constituencies.
I mean, I guess my own view is that this administration worked pretty hard to square that circle. So on one hand, which is to say that like ultimately we need to get very rapidly to a clean energy future. And we've made historic investments in doing just that and to deploy clean energy at speed and scale and to encourage countries around the world to follow a similar path. And at the same time have said, it is unacceptable for American households and, from the perspective of our allies, for German households or British households or French households or Italian households or Indian households to face kind of dramatic dislocations in terms of the, what they have to pay to heat their home or fill the gas tank up or do other things in the meantime. And so when we were, for example, facing the consequences of Russia's invasion and the dramatic shock that had on global energy markets, we were very focused on ensuring that we were not allowing energy markets to dislocate any more than they had, and we're working to get them back to operating smoothly, precisely because, it's not okay in a moment when households are feeling the pinch of higher prices across the board for them to feel the pinch of higher energy prices too. And so when we were, for example, talking about designing the Russian oil price cap, like I said, we had two objectives in mind. Objective one was preserving the stability and continuity of global energy markets. Objective two was conditional on that, minimizing the amount of revenue that Vladimir Putin and his regime were getting. But it, started from a place of, we've got to preserve stability, we've got to preserve, ideally, abundance so that households don't face the pinch that comes from higher energy costs, all the while making historic investments in EVs, in batteries, in solar, in wind, and a bunch of other things to pave the way to a transition that is one of abundance, one of households and businesses being able to get done what they want to do without facing changes in the cost pressures that they face, but ultimately pointing to a world that is much cleaner and meeting its goals on climate as well. So that's kind of how we try to think about it and square it.
Great. And let's conclude with the final question in the back. Yeah.
My question is regarding an agronomy and supply chain question regarding does anyone in the administration pay attention to the agroecology situation and how we've inherited this IOU sort of international relationship? And in particular, is anyone paying attention to the soil erosion? And I know China's buying land in the United States to sort of fix this problem. What is the U.S. doing in regards to soil erosion, or just in general agriculture and some of the food security issues?
Yeah, I mean, so I can speak broadly to that. And again, sort of my own kind of experience at this comes through the prism of Russia's invasion. Between Russia and Ukraine, you see kind of two of the world's biggest producers of grain and the export of grain globally. And in particular, the markets for Ukrainian and Russian grain were and are countries predominantly in Africa, the Horn of Africa in particular, northern Africa, that, otherwise, but for those imports, have been under very significant kind of food stresses and food insecurity. And so a huge amount of my focus in those early months was to figure out ways of getting Ukrainian grain out of Ukraine and back into global markets. In part because it's a key source of export revenue for Ukraine, and getting the Ukrainian economy to a place where it was as best as possible in the midst of a brutal invasion, able to stand on its own feet and finance itself was an important objective. But even more than that, it was a recognition that but for this grain, hundreds of millions of food vulnerable people were going to be exposed to food insecurity. And it was a matter of first order importance to get that grain to market to meet that insecurity. And part of what that experience then exposed me to kind of goes more to your question, which is the recognition that the food security ecosystem has both a short-term dimension to it and a medium and longer-term dimension to it. The short-term dimension is making sure that conditions globally don't allow for dislocations that very urgently put at risk people in vulnerable countries. The medium and long-term problem is how do we ensure that agricultural economies around the world have the tools and the resources they need, whether that be sustainable sources of fertilizer or technology or a range of other things that can ultimately make global agriculture more climate aware, more sustainable, more productive. And that's a hard problem, but I think that to the extent that there was any silver lining to the very immediate focus on food security during the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion, it was that it kind of brought to the top of the agenda a bunch of the food security questions of the medium and long term that otherwise just don't come to the attention of leaders and cabinet ministers and others, in quite the same way.
Well, thank you, Mike, for visiting us and for a wonderful conversation, and thank you all for participating.